everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Slept On Sports podcast, the podcast where we share interesting, lesser-known sports stories that you could say have been slept on. We are back again. It's a very special episode. Got two of my good friends from the very first episode of the podcast. I mean, not like it was that long ago, but we have joining us once again the incredible Brandon Schaff. What's up, Brandon?
What is up, Connor Groel? Man, we're back. We're back. This is great.
I know. I'm excited for you to bring all of your trademark enthusiasm.
Oh my gosh. The last time I was on here, was that the same day that World Series game happened with that finish?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. We saw the little like sound wave of like what it was like before, and then like boom. It was just
yeah, that's the episode that I had to do my most sound editing because we had a couple minutes in the middle where it was just completely useless because we had the walk-off in the World Series and we just absolutely lost our minds. Not to mention there was like 8 of us in the room. It was quite an event at that podcast. And then also joining us today, we have Mike Tyrrell, who after watching this week's Pitt Northwestern basketball game will probably never watch a basketball game from either of his two schools ever again.
Yeah, hey, Connor, what's up? Brandon, welcome back as well. I don't think I've seen a game so pathetic and also amazing at the same time. I struggled to figure out who I was going to root for throughout, but then I realized that what Northwestern did was something that Pitt does all the time. So I just kind of accepted the result as it was. But let's just say that was not quality basketball. And I hope that I don't ever have to witness a spectacle again like that.
So do you think your high school team, how do you think they would have fared against either one of these programs?
I mean, I'd give them a shot. The thing is, they would probably lose that way as well. So I feel like every team that I follow tends to lose in a similar fashion. We had the high school team where I used to work tended to have similar collapses in big games like that. So let's just say it's been expected.
Yeah. I got to hit your free throws at the end of the games.
Yeah, that'll always get you.
Yeah, I get you every single time. Today we have kind of a special, I guess you can call it special. We have a themed edition of the Slept On Sports podcast. It is Spurs week. So there you go.
I love it. Championship pedigree. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, championship pedigree. Every story that we're going to be talking about this week will involve the San Antonio Spurs in one way or another. I know, Brandon, you have an interesting story for us lined up about one of the Spurs' most probably underrated players over the years and just a guy that I think made it farther in his career than anybody really expected him to. So why don't you lead us off today?
Yeah, definitely. And I also, just real quick, I'm curious, what inspired the Spurs theme for today's episode?
I mean, I'm not going to lie. I know I had a really cool story involving the Spurs that I wanted to get on the podcast at some point in time. And then I think there was a night where me and Mike were just, kind of trying to brainstorm some more ideas. And we also came up with another idea relating to the Spurs. And then I thought, hey, we have 2 Spurs ideas. Why don't we shoot for one more? And then we can make this a whole thing. So I think we have 3 pretty good Spurs stories, all different. But I think we have some good stuff for you guys today. And I cannot wait to hear about your player, Brandon. Who are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm excited for this guy. So I'm talking about DeJuan Blair. And, this is a guy, I know Mike is excited about this because this is a Pitt guy, so
Hell to Pitt.
It'll bring back some memories for him. Did you have any experience watching him, Mike?
Yeah, I went to Pitt. My freshman year was in 2010, and he was a star on the 2009 team that got all the way to the Elite Eight before they lost to Villanova in that insane game in Boston, from what I remember. So, yeah, I remember watching him a lot in college, and I just enjoyed him a lot. I love that Pitt team with Jamie Dixon. So, and then eventually he played in the NBA, and obviously you'll talk about that a lot. But, yeah, I followed him a lot, and I was really happy when I heard that you were going to be doing them.
Yeah, he actually has an incredible backstory, and I'll get into that after I just kind of give some background about him. So he's a guy, who grew up in Pittsburgh. He went to Shenley High School, if you know where that is, if I'm pronouncing that right, I hope.
Mm-hmm.
He had over 1,500 points while he was there. He went undefeated in the Pittsburgh City League, so he never lost a game against a lot of those local opponents there. He gets recruited by so many colleges. Besides Pitt, he also had offers from Florida, Kansas State, Indiana, my school. Wish he would have gone there, but that's besides the point. Marquette, Miami, West Virginia, Wake Forest, and Tennessee. So he definitely was all over the place. He was a top recruit. He goes to Pittsburgh. He commits there, makes the All-American freshman team, helps the Panthers win the Big East Conference tournament, and they get a 4 seed in the tournament that year. So that's in his freshman year. And he became the first freshman in Pitt history to finish with 400 points and 300 rebounds. That's crazy. As a freshman, nobody does that. I mean, Anthony Davis does that, but he does not. DeJuan Blair, man.
And real quick, if I could just interject. No, go ahead, Connor.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying, immediate impact. Again, you see it from, these Kentucky Duke schools, but for a lot of these 4-year programs, and especially Pitt, I think, they're in a bit of a down period for the program. But at this time, and I'm sure he's part of it, but Pitt was really, around the end of the 2000s, that decade, they were a real powerhouse team. And I think a lot of people forget that. Probably a lot of our younger fans might not even remember that. But yeah, this is a team that, especially his sophomore season, but this is a team that, I remember multiple occasions having number 1, number 2 seeds in March Madness. So this was a team that could really play.
Yeah. And Mike, what were you saying?
No, Connor said the exact same thing.
Right.
People don't really remember Pitt, and they were really good for a long time.
Seriously. And so, yeah, right before he gets drafted, he has that stellar sophomore year that you were just talking about right before, you were there in 2010. That year, they're the 1 seed in the tournament. He finishes second for the National Player of the Year, right behind Blake Griffin. So that's insane, and he declares for the draft, and he's out after 2 years. And even though they didn't win the NCAA tournament, like you said, they went pretty far, and he showed out so well. But he actually fell a little bit when he was drafted in 2009 by the Spurs, because you would think, with somebody putting up numbers like that, where he's a double-double machine, you'd think that's, pretty good first-round potential. But, his size, the fact that he's only 6'7", combined with the fact that he had some major lower body injuries all the way back when he was in high school, which fortunately didn't really impede his success when he was in college. But it was something that NBA scouts were a little concerned about. And that is kind of the whole idea of why his story is so interesting, why this is a slept-on sports story. The fact that he tore, well, at least injured both of his ACLs when he was in high school, actually had to have surgery on both of them. And the doctors actually, instead of removing them completely, they tried to repair it, but were unsuccessful. And that ultimately meant that his ACLs just completely disappeared from his legs. So he actually didn't even know that this happened after the surgery, but eventually they just completely left his knees. So he goes on, he plays, and the rest of the muscles around, that area in his knee actually wound up just filling, the load, and compensating for it and allowing all of his weight, to still be able to play the game at the highest level. And so he's ultimately able to have that career with Pittsburgh. And that's amazing considering those circumstances. And then now he gets drafted finally by the Spurs, but he falls to the second round. He gets drafted 37th overall. And so you understand, the injuries were obviously a big deal, but you wonder how, that's going to affect his playing style. And as soon as he gets to the NBA, he pretty much continues right where he left off when he was at Pitt, just double doubles over and over again. And he actually, in his first NBA game, he had a double double of 14 points and 11 rebounds in just 23 minutes. So it wasn't quite the same level of production that you saw before. But then you see even later in that year, he has 23 rebounds in a game and becomes the first NBA rookie since Tim Duncan in 97-98, which is it's pretty incredible when he won Rookie of the Year to post a 20-20 game. So That was 20 points and 20 rebounds. So it was insane to kind of see some of the things that happen here. He winds up getting invited to the rookie challenge at the All-Star game, and winds up being the co-MVP as well, which is amazing, along with the Kings Tyreek Evans, which of course Brevin would appreciate, big Kings guy. Mm-hmm. And he goes on, and everything just kind of keeps going decently. He never really sees that same level of success that he saw earlier on in his career, but he definitely had all of these really nice standout moments, and he always had these games where he was just putting up numbers that were just up there, that were historic if you think about it, especially for a big man. And that the rebounding machine, and Mike, this better than anybody, knowing him pretty well. He just, the fact that he could put up as many as 20, 30 rebounds in a single game had to be insane to watch, and to actually realize that this is somebody who can really get it done on both ends of the court. And then that was able to continue until eventually the Spurs just found people to replace him in the starting lineup, because eventually people like Tiago Splitter just became better players. And we all know how great the Spurs were throughout the 2000s, and even throughout the early 2010s, and even throughout the 2010s. I mean, they made it competitive, pretty much all the way even into the Warriors dynasty, and by that point, he's already off the team. He winds up going, Blair goes to the Mavericks in 2013. He's there for a year. Then he goes to the Wizards for 2 years. And then after that, he just keeps bouncing around. He goes to China to play for a little bit, and then he comes back, plays in the now G League, but the D League. And then just kind of goes, through the motions, and it's pretty much at a point now where, he's not playing for any teams. He's a free agent. He could get signed if he wanted to, but he just had all of these opportunities, to really show out. And he did, but you really do wonder, what could have been had those injuries have not happened, and he never won a championship, which is really weird considering the fact that he was on the Spurs at a time when he just was there at the wrong time. It was in between the championships, the early Tim Duncan days, and later on with Kawhi Leonard, really kind of taking up the mantle. He just kind of a story of just being in the wrong place at the wrong time and having things just not work out as well as they could have. But he did a really good job giving back to his high school. He never forgot about, his roots. He always made it a point to go back to Pittsburgh and to kind of give back in the way that he could and help out in the community. So that kind of becomes the legacy, of someone like Blair. And that's why he slept on.
I think there are a couple interesting things here that I know you touched on a little bit, but I think they deserve to be touched on even more. The first part of this is that, you mentioned, him as a center, which, you think, oh, he's, 6'10", 6'11", 7 feet tall. DeJuan Blair is 6'7". He's so undersized for his position. And when you think about the fact that, he never plays, massive, huge amounts of minutes on these Spurs teams, which is why I think some of his numbers don't immediately jump out at you, although they're much better on, a per 36 basis. But this is a guy that was starting for the San Antonio Spurs. Again, this historic organization, the best organization in basketball over the last quarter of a century. And he makes, if I can just test myself with the math real quick, 166 starts for these Spurs teams across 4 different seasons, which is incredible, in of itself. And you think kind of revolution. Maybe that's going a bit too far, but he is really one of the first kind of small ball mold centers that we see. He's got, a similar enough body type to a guy like Draymond Green that we eventually see, acting, in a similar role. Draymond Green, much more of a facilitator, but again, to be, a smaller guy, but to also be, a very strong rebounder for his height, which I think is, we saw with guys like Charles Barkley that, Charles Barkley might have been listed at 6'7", but we know Charles Barkley is maybe 6'4", 6'5", to really, have control over that kind of area of the game, despite his size. Again, Dennis Rodman, you think a lot of the NBA's greatest rebounders are actually not as tall as you would expect them to be. And the all-time leading rebounder in college basketball, which I know, is Kenneth Faried, and he's only 6'8". So a lot of these, again, he's a smaller guy, but he plays really well within his role. He achieves a ton of success within the Spurs organization. I mean, you said he doesn't win a championship, but again, this is teams that, are first round or are number one seeds, actually as a bit of a foreshadowing. I mean, Mike's going to talk about one of the teams that DeJuan Blair is on.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Just achieving a lot of success, especially when you consider that this man has no ACLs.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that's crazy. And, he joins the team, and they're on the, the fringe of being at the top of their division again. And they're, kind of a fringe playoff team. And as soon as he gets there, they're first every single year. And, if you remember those early 2010s years back when the Spurs and the Thunder were going head to head every single year, and a few years later, right before right after he leaves, when KD wins the, MVP, it's interesting to see, how that developed, into something. And he missed it by that much. Like if he was just there for one more year, he would have been able to be on that team that eventually beat LeBron James's Heat, so it's just kind of the coulda, shoulda, woulda, but, you hit it over the head. It's interesting to look at like his height compared to college players and even just compared to NBA players. Like the average height of a center in the NBA is 6'9", so he's already below that. And then if you look at, even just on his team, not that, David Robinson was there anymore, but he was 7'1", back when it was just the tower, that was Tim Duncan and David Robinson. And, Tim Duncan was 6'11". There's a reason why those guys were, going toe to toe with the best of the best, because, the way that the game was played in the 2000s, with a lot less shooting and a lot more inside, just bruiser basketball, it got the job done.
I think it's interesting, too, that when he goes to the Mavericks in 2013-14, they're the Spurs' arch rivals, and he plays in the first round series against the Spurs. The Spurs are the 1 seed and the Mavs are the 8 seed. And that's that crazy series where Vince Carter hits that game-winning shot and actually goes to 7 games, I believe, and the Spurs do survive and win against a Mavericks team that really wasn't the 8 seed. They were much better than that. But it's just interesting to see him go against the Spurs again. But I like what you said about how he gave back to his community, how he always remembered where he came from in Pittsburgh. And being someone that lived in Pittsburgh for 5 years, that's like a big thing about that city. It's a smaller city, but it's also a very well-knit city, and it's a well-knit community. And I've seen a lot that athletes that are from that area, athletes that live in that area, they like to always associate with Pittsburgh. They like to always associate with the places, the towns, the neighborhoods that they came from. And so I just thought it was very interesting that DeJuan Blair kind of continues that tradition by continuing to kind of give back to the community where he came from, which I think is so important.
It definitely is. Athlete activism is huge. It's something that we talk about as students at Northwestern, right now. And you see this, over the years play out in a variety of different ways. And a lot of athletes try to, a lot of, people who become successful, you never want to forget about your roots. They're the people that built you eventually into what you became, and even though someone like Blair, maybe didn't quite get to the level that he wanted to, he still was able to propel himself to, exceptional, levels of success, considering the circumstances, considering the fact that even though the doctors kind of messed up with his knees, it didn't matter. And that really was very lucky on his part too, that he was able to have the career that he was, because just think about, how tricky the ACL business is. Look at Derrick Rose, that hits way too close, to home for me.
Got to bring Derrick Rose back into everything, Brandon.
He was my favorite player, and he's leading us. I'm thinking he's, going to be our next Mike Jordan, and we're ready, we're ready to get to the finals. And then literally after LeBron James, prevents us from getting there, just 1 year later, it's all over. It's all over, because in the first round, he tears his ACL. And I guess it just goes to show, what a difference that makes, having that happen later in your career as opposed to towards the beginning, maybe when your body is able to adapt to that a little bit more, because Rose was just never the same player after that. But fortunately, Blair, was. And, you know, he also played a different position. You know, you got to understand that too. He's a big man compared to Rose being a point guard. You know, so someone like Rose is going to be running all over the place all the time. And the risk of injury, especially, you know, when he just kept injuring himself over and over again after that too, you understand why. You know, the style of play is going to influence that. But yeah, it was good that he was able to have the career that he did.
Yeah, and Derrick Rose is still a very good player, but you're right that, you know, he wins the MVP award. He's the youngest ever winner of the MVP award. And then all of a sudden people, really think you're right. I mean, I'm not going to say he would have been Michael Jordan, but he would have been, you know, the best player that organization has seen since Michael Jordan. And to be honest, he probably still is regardless. But
exactly.
You're right. As someone that could have competed for, you know, multiple MVP awards, had championship aspirations with that team, and he was still only, you know, I don't know, 23 years old, 24 when he tears his ACL, around that age. That's someone that had so much, you know, potential. And I think DeJuan Blair, again, he doesn't get near the highs of his career as Derrick Rose did. But I think the way he was able to fight back is really incredible. And also, I think it's also underrated that, you know, I think your first round draft pick in the NBA is usually someone that you expect, you know, to see a lot from, particularly if he's in the lottery. But once you get into the second round, you see, you know, a lot of second round guys struggle to make rosters. A lot of second round guys don't even make the roster their rookie season. You know, there's a lot of, you know, a mix between the second rounders and the undrafted players and guys fighting for spots. For DeJuan Blair, as a guy who was drafted in the second round to the Spurs, you know, a team that's already established with guys like Tim Duncan, to immediately carve out a role for himself, to start 23 games as a rookie, to get 18 minutes a game as a rookie, and then to be their starting center for the, you know, pretty much every game for the next 2 seasons. And then he starts to get into a bit of a reduced role, which is why he ends up, you know, getting, you know, unhappy and going to Dallas instead. Although he does play in the 2013 NBA Finals, the finals with the, you know, famous Ray Allen shot in Game 6 that kind of shifts the momentum and allows Miami to actually win that series in 7. But, you know, I think even he overperformed expectations, you know, after his injuries in high school. But then even once he got into the NBA, I think, especially, you know, again, as the 6'7" center in the second round, I think he outperforms all of his expectations for his NBA career also.
Yeah. And, you know, it's unfortunate because he's somebody, you know, who was really right up there, you know, with a player like Blake Griffin when he was in college. But if you really look at how they were, you know, once they got into the league, you know, whether you want to blame it on the injuries or not, it just never got to the level that it did for somebody like Blake. And there's a reason why he was drafted number 1 overall too. And, you know, someone like Blair was drafted in the second round. You know, he's not even in the top 30. So
yeah, I also don't think DeJuan Blair could jump over that Kia.
No, exactly. No. Oh, wait,
that goes without saying.
Yeah.
That's great. But yeah, you know, DeJuan Blair, another one of these guys. I think there are so many stories in the NBA about guys kind of outperforming their expectations. And for him, with such a, you know, unique kind of play style, and especially with his, you know, injury history and all the success he was able to bring to Pitt, and then jumping right in, you know, with the Spurs, I think, you know, we can't, you know, understate that it would have probably been much easier for him to, you know, find more playing time, you know, maybe in another organization, but also maybe because of how solid the Spurs organization is, it may have made it actually easier for him to kind of carve out a niche within that team. But again, just playing with the San Antonio Spurs, reaching the NBA Finals. Also, a little side note before we end, he does go, I don't know if you guys watch over the summers, the basketball tournament, the TBT. But in 2017, he joined the Overseas Elite at the TBT, and they won the championship.
They're the dynasty.
He does get a title. A little later.
So he got that ring somehow.
There you go.
They're the team that won like every year in a row, Overseas Elite. So
they had won, gosh, I don't know, probably at least 4 years in a row. So he jumped on that team.
Yeah, they dominated.
Yeah. So just dominating wherever he finds himself. And, this is a guy, he's still only 31 years old. So actually, I think his basketball playing career might have come to an end, although you can't be sure. But again, still a pretty young guy. So interesting to see how what he decides to do in the next stage of his life. But yeah, good talking about DeJuan Blair. We did mention a little bit that he played on a very good Spurs team that Mike was going to talk about. This was kind of a more positive story for the Spurs. This next one, it's a story about the Spurs. I'm not sure if Spurs fans are going to be as happy to hear about it, but a good Spurs team that plays in a very interesting playoff series. Mike, you want to lead us off with this one?
Yeah, so just the disclaimer, I am a Dallas Mavericks fan. I don't know if I've professed that fandom on this before. So when you said at first we were going to do a Spurs show, I was kind of like, oh, God, really? But when I discovered that I could do this story, I was very happy with it because, as you'll see, the Mavs tend to get known as the team that did this, but a lot of people don't talk about the Spurs doing the same thing. And I would argue it could even be perceived as even worse. So kind of a background here, only 5 eighth-seeded teams in NBA playoff history have defeated the 1 seed. It's only happened 5 times. And prior to the 2011 season, and it only happened 3 times before. Obviously, this is a rarity. And you see this now, like, this year, the Bucks, they lost game 1 to the Magic, and everyone was like, oh my God, like maybe something could happen, especially in the bubble where they're on home court and everything. But then the Bucks just dominated the rest of the way. And then in the Western Conference, the Lakers lost game 1, but they did the same thing as well. It's very difficult for an 8th seed, especially now, to beat a 1 seed. And going into the 2011 season, only 3 teams had ever done that before. The Nuggets did it over the Sonics in 94. And the Heat did it. The Knicks did it over the Heat in 99. And both of those series were 5 games. So, it's a shorter playoff series than it is now in the first round, especially in 99. It was a lockout year. So they didn't even play the full season. So the Heat, who were the 1 seed, they had 33 wins and the Knicks had 27. So it wasn't like a massive discrepancy at that time. The 94 series, the Sonics had 63 wins and the Nuggets had 42. So it was a much bigger upset. And the Nuggets actually had won 3 straight games. So that was like a really big deal at the time. But still, it was only a 5-game series. And you wonder if there had been best of 7, would the Sonics have won the next 2 games? But I think a lot of people always remember, and sadly for me, the 2007 NBA first round playoffs when the Mavericks had the best record in the league. They had 67 wins. Dirk was the MVP. And it looked like they were going to cruise to the title. They were the best team by far that season. And they ran into the 8th-seeded Warriors. This is the Warriors before the Steph Curry Warriors. And they only had 42 wins that season. And the Warriors beat the Mavs in 6 games that year. It was the first time that a team that an 8th seed had beat a 1 seed in the playoffs in a 7-game format. And everyone loves to talk about those Warriors. They were so cool and they were so exciting. And that was obviously like a big moment in the Mavs history because it seemed like at that point the Mavs were just going to fade into oblivion. And luckily for them, they didn't because they won the finals in 2011, which happens to be this season that I'm talking about. And one of the reasons that the Mavs were able to win the 2011 NBA Finals is because the top-seeded Spurs lost in the first round to the Memphis Grizzlies, becoming only the 4th team ever to lose as a 1 seed in the NBA playoffs. This was truly an incredible series and kind of stunning when you look at the fact that these 2 franchises, the Grizzlies and the Spurs, were completely different at that particular time. When you look at the Spurs, we kind of talked about this already, though. When we got to the 2011 season, they were the model franchise in the NBA. They were considered a dynasty. They had Popovich, Duncan, Parker, Ginobili, even David Robinson, as Brandon mentioned years before. DeJuan Blair was part of the team, although he never won a title. By 2011, the Spurs had won 4 NBA titles. They won in 99, they won in 03, they won in 05, and they won in 2007. In fact, they had made the playoffs every season since 1998, a streak which actually reached 22 straight seasons, which is an NBA record, which just ended this past year. This past NBA year was the first time that the Spurs had missed the playoffs since 1998.
Wow.
So you're talking about this dominant model franchise. And like Brandon said, and like Connor said, they had been consistently at the top in the Western Conference for all of these seasons. So when you look at them and say they're the 1 seed, you expect them to have no problem making it far in the playoffs. But they're going against a Grizzlies team which kind of had no history. They had just been founded in 1995, and they weren't even from Memphis. They were from Vancouver. They relocated to Memphis in 2001. You talk about two completely different franchises. The Spurs, 4 NBA titles. The Grizzlies had not even won a division title. So we're talking about two teams coming from two completely different spheres. And the Grizzlies had not even made the playoffs since 2006. So for those 4 seasons after 2006 all the way to 2011, they had 22 wins, 22 wins, 24 wins, and then 40 wins. So this is a completely inexperienced team going against the team that had won 4 NBA titles, where you have some of the best players in NBA history, arguably maybe one of, if not the best coach in NBA history, one of them anyway. You would look at it on paper and say it is a complete and total mismatch going into these playoffs. And I remember this season particularly. I was a freshman in college at the time. Did you guys watch this series? Did you guys remember this series at all? Grizzlies Spurs in 2011?
I mean, obviously, I remember the NBA Finals that year. I don't think I have a lot of memories specifically of watching this series, but it is crazy when you think about, the Grizzlies. I don't think they, as a franchise, Vancouver or Memphis, had actually won a playoff series coming into this series.
That's correct.
And for people that are not aware of the disaster that was the Vancouver Grizzlies, the Vancouver Grizzlies, I mean, we could try to do a story about them at some point, but they legitimately have an argument to be the worst, professional basketball team ever.
Oh, God. That's terrible.
I'm going to read you off now their records for they spend 6 seasons in Vancouver before they end up moving to Memphis. And like Mike said, I think they only have maybe 1 playoff appearance in Memphis before this season. At the very least, they don't win a series.
And they got swept. They didn't even win a game.
Oh, yeah. So in Vancouver, 1995-96 season is where we start. Their first year, 15-67.
Oh, my. They had 67 losses?
Brandon,
losses?
We have not.
That is correct, Brandon.
It should not even be allowed. You should be kicked out of the league just for doing that one time.
I mean, eventually they were. They were moved to.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
So they did have to relocate.
So I guess they. Yeah.
That is not as bad as it gets.
Oh, stop it!
The following year, after going 15-67, they go 14-68. Then they have a really big year. This will be the only year where they don't finish last place in their division. They actually finish second to last. They go 19-63.
Nice. Well done.
So that's a big one for them. Then the next year, that shortened lockout year with the 50-game schedule, they actually have their worst winning percentage. They go 8-42.
Oh, these guys.
And then
that is incredible.
Yeah. And then they finish out their time. And by the way, attendance for the first 4 years of the Grizzlies in Vancouver are all in the 16,000, 17,000 fans per game range. And then for the last 2 years, it dips under 14,000 because people are fed up at this.
Oh, boy. They've had enough.
The last 2 seasons are actually their 2 best seasons, 22-60. And then in the 2000-2001 season, their final season, they have their best record in Vancouver, where they go 23-59.
Jeez, man. You're making the trust the process 76ers sound like, potential championship contenders compared to the Vancouver. Yeah, oh my God.
I think I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's something maybe in the future, maybe like a Canadian themed podcast or something where Vancouver gets thrown in there, because that's a very interesting story. But no, I mean, you're absolutely right. You're talking about this franchise, which had been a disgrace. They had moved to Memphis. They hadn't even won a playoff game yet. So when I talk about how this was just a massive upset, most people tend to think, the Mavs and the Warriors. And don't get me wrong, this is not because I'm a Mavs fan. That was a massive upset. Absolutely. Totally. But this Grizzlies team had nothing. They had done nothing. They had no history whatsoever, and they're going against one of the greatest dynasties in NBA history and one of the best model franchises of consistency. And, you look at this, there's no shot they could win this series. How could they? And yet, obviously, they do, and it just doesn't get talked about as much. So, when you look at this 2011 season, the Spurs were the 1 seed in the West. They won 61 games. They were 6th in total offense, 2nd in offensive efficiency. Like I said, you have Tim Duncan. He's 34 at this time, but he's still putting up close to a double-double for the season. He had 13 points, almost 9 rebounds. You have Tony Parker, who's really taken on the mantle as maybe the key player on this team. He's only 28. He's averaging 17.5 points, 6.6 assists. And then you have Manu Ginobili, 33 years old, 17 points, almost 5 assists. You also have a young George Hill at the time who's averaging close to 12 points a game. And you have Richard Jefferson on this team. This is a solid Spurs team, including DeJuan Blair, as we mentioned before.
Right.
But when you look at this Grizzlies team, they actually were not bad for an 8 seed, and that's maybe one of the reasons why the Warriors' upset might be viewed as more pivotal, because the Warriors had only won 42 games. This Grizzlies team won 46. They went 46-36, but they were still an 8th. They were coached by Lionel Hollins, who was there for a while. Then he eventually became the coach of the Nets, I believe. They had an average team in general. I mean, their offense was in the middle, 12th offense total. Their defense was actually pretty good. It was 9th total in the league. But they were known for having a very young group of core players. Rudy Gay, he was 24 at the time. Mike Conley, he was 23 at the time. It's crazy when we're talking about Mike Conley, who now is an old veteran, and we're talking about him in 2011 as this young stud coming out of college not too long ago. OJ Mayo, if you remember that name, he was 23 at the time. So this was a really young core. Rudy Gay he averaged close to 20 points that season. But the 2 big names on this team that are really going to carry them in this round, Marc Gasol, who was 26 at the time, and the best player on this team by far, Zach Randolph, who was 29 years old. He was the star of this team. He averaged 20 points, 12 rebounds during the regular season. So he's going to be the guy that really takes the mantle of this team into the playoffs. What's interesting is these are division rivals. They played each other 4 times during the season, and they actually split 2-2. And the Spurs lost both the games in Memphis. So, obviously the playoffs are different, and especially nowadays when we have the load management and we have teams that rest every other day, it's very difficult to, interpret how a playoff series will play out. But back then in 2011, this is before teams were resting their players significantly. And so when you look and say this Spurs team that was the top seed in the West, they lost 2 games to the Grizzlies, both in Memphis. You kind of looked at it and said, this matchup could actually be tricky for the Spurs going into that playoff series. And really quickly, this 2011 season, I remember it very well. Like I said, I was a freshman in college at the time, and it's the year that the Mavs win the finals, so it's personally my favorite year ever. But it was actually one of the most hyped up and exciting NBA seasons ever. You had, of course, the Big 3 in Miami, the first season with them together. LeBron,
yeah,
Bosh,
the decision was that previous summer.
100%. You have your Derrick Rose MVP season in 2011. So that's something, of course, you'll remember greatly. You mentioned the Thunder before. The Thunder are starting to rise at this time. Durant, Westbrook, and Harden. I think they win 55 games this year. They get the 4 seed, which is crazy to think that 55 games get you to the 4 seed. But the West was actually very competitive at this time. And then something people also tend to forget, the Lakers were going for a 3-peat that season. They had won in 2009. They had won in 2010. And so Kobe and company, the last ride, this will end up being the last year for Phil Jackson. They're going for a 3-peat. So this is a very exciting season. And yet the Spurs, despite winning 61 games, were very much under the radar because it was kind of like, oh, it's the Spurs again. And no one really had the energy, we're like, all right, we'll wait for them in the playoffs. But they really did not get as much press as, the Lakers shooting for this 3-peat, the Heat, Derrick Rose. So when this series happened in April of 2011, everyone just kind of thought, all right, the Spurs are going to win and we'll see what happens. And a lot of people thought we're going to see a Spurs Thunder, second round matchup. We'll see Spurs Lakers, Spurs Mavs later on. Nobody saw what was going to happen actually happen. So really quickly, the way the series broke down, game 1 is in San Antonio, and this was a shocking game. The Spurs were winning throughout the entire game into the fourth quarter. Looked like they were going to win. You always never want to lose home court, right away in a series, especially in game 1. but the Grizzlies score 31 points in the fourth quarter, and they hit a go-ahead three-pointer by Shane Battier. Talk about another veteran on this team.
Wow.
To end up taking a 1-point lead. Unbelievable. Shane Battier, who will then go on and help the Heat win a championship a couple years later. Actually, I think the next year he wins it with them too. And the Grizzlies win by 3 points. They take home court in game one. They steal it from the Spurs, and they win their first ever playoff game as a franchise. Zach Randolph, 25 points, 14 rebounds. That's just going to be a theme of this series, is Zach Randolph going off. So the Grizzlies shock everyone in game one. And everyone thinks, all right, we'll see what happens in game two. And the Spurs winning game two, 93-87, kind of holding serve. They were always kind of winning. It was never really in doubt. It did get to a 2-point game late, but ultimately the Spurs do win. And now they go to Memphis. But like I said before, the Grizzlies had won both games in Memphis during the regular season. So they come in with a lot of confidence that we could beat this team. And in game three in Memphis, with this crowd going nuts, the Grizzlies were winning throughout. They were up 8 in the fourth quarter, looking like they were going to win. And all of a sudden, the Spurs came right back and tied the game. And it was a very tight game with less than 5 minutes to play. But led by the typical Zach Randolph, who finished with 25 points, plus he hit a key three-pointer at the end to seal the deal. The Grizzlies won 91-88. So far, we've had 3 games. The first game was a 3-point game. The second game was a 6-point game. And the third point was a 3-point game. This is a very tight series. It doesn't really feel like it's 8 versus 1. And by the time we get to game 4, actually, if we finish game 4, it definitely does not feel like it's an 8-1 series, because game 4 is not even close. It was close at halftime, but then the Grizzlies scored. They took a massive lead in the third quarter. They outscored the Spurs 30-15 in the fourth quarter. They took a massive lead. They went up by 20 and they dominated, and they won 104-86. And just like that, it's 3-1 Grizzlies.
Jeez.
Which is just incredible. And it doesn't feel like it's an actual 8 versus 1 matchup. This Grizzlies team was actually really, really good. And like I said, winning 46 games as the 8 seed is very impressive. I mean, the last couple of seasons, these 8 seeds are winning like less than 40 games. They're getting to 40 and 42, I feel like, is a very typical record for an 8 seed. This was not an 8 seed, but they were still, once again, the Grizzlies. And I think that's the theme I'm trying to drive here, is that this team had never won anything. Connor just said that the Vancouver team was just atrocious. I mean, this is a massive upset that's about to happen here. And game 5, I remember watching this, actually. I was in my dorm room as a little innocent freshman at Pitt. And I was watching this game, and I was thinking, you got to be kidding me. The Spurs are going to lose. Let's go. Because the Mavs obviously would have a wide open playoff path at that point. And this was a wild, wild game. It was back and forth. The Grizzlies, going at it with Zach Randolph. And then I think Manu Ginobili had a massive game. He scored 33 points. It was an epic, epic game 5. The Grizzlies were up 3 points, 97-94, with 1.7 seconds left. They were on the verge of this upset. And then, of all people, Gary Neal, who actually was kind of a solid role player for the Spurs that year, he hit a wild 25-foot three-pointer top of the key to send the game to overtime, and the Spurs ended up winning by 7 in overtime. And you kind of felt that the series was going to change, that it was going to be the series changer, that the Grizzlies were so close. The Spurs hit this ridiculous three-pointer, and I kind of felt like it was going to happen. The Spurs were going to win, because I kept thinking there's no way the Spurs and Greg Popovich and Tim Duncan, there's no way that they're going to get upset in the first round by a team that had never done anything before. But game 6 is in Memphis, and up until this point, the Spurs had been 0-4 in Memphis this season. So odds were very favorable in the Grizzlies, and this was a game that Zach Randolph took over. It was a close game in the fourth quarter, like all these games were. There was a tight series. There was only really one blowout this entire series. In the final 4 minutes of the fourth quarter, where it was essentially a tied game, Zach Randolph scored 10 of the next 12 Grizzly points. They ended up leading by 10 points. They won by 8. Zach Randolph finishes with 31, and the Memphis Grizzlies become the 4th team in NBA history as the 8th seed to defeat the 1 seed, winning their first ever playoff series which I think doesn't get discussed as much because, once again, maybe that Mavericks-Warriors series was just seen as just so much better. But, like, once again, this Grizzlies team, it wasn't an 8 seed. And, in fact, they took the Thunder, the Durant, Harden, and Westbrook Thunder, to 7 games in the next round. Like, the Grizzlies almost got to the Western Conference Finals as an 8 seed. They were not a regular 8 seed. But once again, the point of the matter is they had never won anything ever before, and the Spurs had won 4 championships up until that point. They're only 2 years away, or a few years away from winning a 5th, and yet they lost to the Grizzlies. Ultimately, this opens up the path to the Mavericks, who then win the West, who then win the NBA Finals. So thank you for the Spurs for doing that. But really, one last point. We talked about how the Grizzlies had just been awful forever. This win, this playoff win opens up this like golden period for the Grizzlies, where they actually make the playoffs 6 straight seasons after this, including in 2013, when they win 56 games, which is certainly a franchise record, and they made the Western Conference Finals before getting swept by, of course, the Spurs, who got their revenge in that, who then win the finals. But, you know, it's a crazy story. The fact that the Spurs lose in the first round as the 1 seed to the Grizzlies, and I think it was deserved.
You know, this is crazy, Mike, because I have been a secondarily Thunder fan like the whole time that Durant was there. So I was following everything that was going on in the Western Conference playoffs the whole time that the Thunder and the Spurs were going back and forth, back and forth. I did not realize at all that the Grizzlies had done the same thing to the Spurs that they also did to the Thunder in 2013, where the Thunder, if you look at that year, they had, oh my gosh, this was insane. They had I'm trying to remember the year here. So they had 58 wins that year. Or sorry, no, I'm looking at the Spurs. They had more than that. They had 60 wins. The Thunder had 60 wins. They were first in the West, and they lost to the Grizzlies in the second round in a playoff series when Kevin Durant was averaging 30 points a game, every single game. And stinking Zach Randolph, I remember watching this dude and being like, I have no idea who this guy is, but he just keeps going and going. And I remember, so I'm looking at those numbers from that year that you're talking about. So he averaged 22 points and 10 rebounds, almost 11 rebounds a game in that playoff year in 2011, in 2010, 2011. 2 years later, when I'm talking about when he beat the Thunder, he goes back up to averaging 10 rebounds a game, which I remember being a huge problem that the Thunder just could not respond to. And he's averaging, 17 points a game. So he's still, he's this guy who I'm not going to say that like nobody knows who Zach Randolph is, but he's almost underrated in the sense that he's like this giant killer because both it's the Thunder and the Spurs unequivocally in the West for years up until the Warriors take over. There's no one else that's really even in the conversation. So the fact that the Grizzlies go through this period now where they're making the playoffs every single year, they're getting to the point where they're on the brink of getting to the finals, and then the Spurs get the revenge, and then the Thunder ultimately got their revenge too because they were able to come back and, pretty much knock them out, until KD left, the Thunder ultimately. But it's just interesting to see like how these teams, which you think about Mike Conley too, and that's kind of the reason why people were so hyped about Mike Conley going to the Jazz, because when he got there, it's like, oh, well, they lost, a really great player in Gordon Hayward, so they're going to have to try to pick up the pieces here. And, with Rudy Gobert and Mike Conley, you're like, and then now Donovan Mitchell, you're like, okay, there's a reason why these guys had this level of hype because of what they were able to do at this period when the Grizzlies were kind of in their heyday. And now they're kind of back to just being really mediocre / terrible, and that's why they're able to kind of rebuild and kind of go forward with Ja Morant. But it's interesting to see how those teams were able to, and in the West too, like the West throughout the whole decade and throughout all of the 2000s pretty much has been impossible to be competitive in if you're not at the top. And the Grizzlies found a way to do that. And I was always so surprised at their ability to just not shrink under pressure against these guys who, like I said, KD's averaging 30 points a game. He was just the MVP a couple years ago. And then you talk about the Spurs, you look at how great Tim Duncan still was. He's still playing like the best power forward one of the best that the game has ever seen. And you wonder, what were they having for breakfast for these games, man? Like what was in Zach Randolph's breakfast that was giving him the power, to have 20 points and 10 rebounds against some of the best defenses in the league and offenses, and to be able to outscore them enough to upset them.
Right. And this Thunder team in 2013, first of all, Zach Randolph is incredibly underrated.
Yes.
He was he was in the league until just maybe, a year or two ago with the Kings even. Still doing his thing. His production never leveled off that much, actually. And, he was, an interesting kind of player. People always made the jokes about how he never left the ground. But, he was, again, such a solid guy, and a guy that partially I think he gets done in by, being older at this time also. But really the, analytics revolution that the NBA is in kind of destroys the Zach Randolph play style. Where it was,
unfortunately, absolutely.
I don't think we're ever going to see a Zach Randolph again, honestly. But the fact that he was doing that for so long,
I don't know. Maybe someone like Zion.
That's a good point, actually.
Zion has a very similar playing style.
They have. It's funny that they have they have a relatively similar play style for the fact that Zach Randolph never jumps and Zion exclusively jumps very high.
Exactly. Right.
Right. But offensively, they do actually fill out a similar-ish kind of role, which I think is kind of interesting. And again, we want to talk about two more guys that are probably undersized for their position, but very strong. Zach Randolph and Zion Williamson. But then also this Thunder team that you're talking about in 2013, I think I'm not sure if people necessarily forget it, but this team was maybe NBA title favorites. This was the team that they reached the NBA finals the year before and lost the Heat, and people just thought, oh, this team is just too young. They had made it to the finals before their time anyways. And that this was really, I think, supposed to be the year that the Thunder really, become the best team in the league. Obviously the three guys that'll eventually get MVPs, Westbrook, Harden, Durant. Serge Ibaka at this time is the best rim protector in the league, one of the best defenders in the league. He was so good that maybe even he goes a bit underrated just with his role on that team. There was a year he averaged 4.5 blocks per game, which is just absurd.
That's ridiculous.
And just so many good role players on that team that, the fact that the Grizzlies were able to make the run that they did again with, just somewhat unassuming Zach Randolph is really impressive.
Yeah, no, Zach Randolph, especially, like you said, very underrated. He was a star at Michigan State in the early 2000s with Tom Izzo. So he was very well known. And then, of course, he, plays his very underrated style of basketball. But, when the Grizzlies and that Thunder, they had that great series in 2011, before the one in 2013, you kind of looked and said, maybe this is going to be the future of this conference. And it sort of was for a little bit. But once again, this just shows how great the Spurs were. Some teams would have been maybe destroyed by losing in the first round like this. But the Spurs just reloaded. Obviously, they got Kawhi. And like you said, role players like Thiago Splitter started to find their way in here. And Parker and Ginobili and Duncan just never got old and just continued to be amazing. And they ended up making 2 more finals and winning another one in dominant fashion against the Heat. But one last thing, just to kind of end this on a positive note for the Mavericks. This is kind of underrated. This is also kind of underrated, but I think their path to the finals that year was one of the hardest in recent history, and they didn't even have to play the Spurs. So I just have to throw that in there as well. The fact that everyone thought they were going to lose the Blazers in the first round. Everyone picked them to lose to the Blazers, and they beat them. Everyone thought they were going to lose to the Lakers, who had won 2 straight. They swept them, sending Phil Jackson into retirement. They beat the Thunder. The Thunder, who were, incredible with Westbrook, Harden, and Durant. That was an incredible series. I don't know if you remember, but every game was close. And the Thunder were just too young, and they blew every lead at the end, and the Mavs just used their veteran abilities to win. And then, of course, the epic finals where Dirk was MVP and just incredible. So, I always said if the Mavericks win the finals, I want them to beat the Spurs on the way. But I think that was fitting that the Spurs, who had been the pest in the Mavericks side for all these years, the thorn in the Mavericks side for all these years, lose in the first round, and the Mavs win the finals after that. But yeah, this is a slept-on story for sure because it doesn't get as much attention as I think it should, considering the circumstances.
Mike, you got me fired up about that. That was one of my favorite slept-on stories we've had because you just brought back some like great and horrible memories at the same time.
So horrible.
I needed to rant about that for a second because I remember being so pissed off that Zach was doing so well because I was like, dude, I thought the Thunder were going to run away with like the whole season. I was like, these guys are crazy. They just won 60 games. They're averaging, the third most points in the league out of everybody. And they were just crushing people, and they were top 10 in defense too. So I was like, okay, KD's averaging 30. Like, this is incredible. He's averaging almost 30 in the playoffs his whole career, and it's only his fourth season, So it was unbelievable. What the Grizzlies did that year, I will never forget it, unfortunately.
It's amazing. So, yep, 2 good sports stories, and then one more Heat story or Spurs story for you guys. I'm going to bring it home with, we've mentioned the Warriors a little bit. I'm going to talk about a game from April 10th, 2016. It is, yes, Brandon, I will make a reference to the 2016 Western.
Oh, no.
Oh, my gosh, Connor, you're going to get me fired up again.
But this is the game where the Warriors tie the Chicago Bulls record with 72 wins in the regular season. And then in their final game of the season after that, they go on and they do set the record with a 73-win regular season. But I want to talk about this game because I am someone that loves, record-setting performances. I'm someone that loves streaks in sports. And this game has so many interesting subplots that, like, I just had to find a way to talk about it on the podcast. This game is, again, I think it's just incredibly interesting. So the first thing that you have to know is obviously this comes towards the end of the Warriors' chase for 73 wins. They now have, this is actually the year before they get Kevin Durant, but they have won the championship the year before. And the Warriors, they start the season on, some ridiculous, like 20-something game winning streak. I think at some point they're like 40-2 in the middle of the season. Those are not exact numbers, but they're having the best start in NBA history. And so everyone starts the chatter, immediately, and even a little bit before the season started, but definitely as they start out so strong, everyone starts talking about, will this team break the Michael Jordan famous record, 72 wins in a regular season? Can they possibly do it? So we get towards the end of the season, we get into April, and they're still on pace that they can still do it. When April starts, this team only has lost 7 games. And again, the Bulls lost 10 games in that season. So they are on pace to do it. However, they start to run into a bit of trouble. On April 2nd, 2016, they are playing the Boston Celtics, and they lose the game at home 109-106. Okay. This drops the Warriors down to 68-8 on the season. But maybe even more interestingly, the Warriors had, entering that game, a 54-game home winning streak, which is the longest winning streak at home in NBA history. And they had also, to that point in the season, they had not lost a single game at home. Okay. So they were also trying to complete a perfect season at home and extend their all-time longest home winning streak. And they lose the game, stops the winning streak at 54 games. Okay. So they also lose a game a couple days later to the Blazers. And that gives them their 9th loss. So once they lose to the Blazers, there's absolutely no more room for error. Or I'm sorry, they beat the Blazers and then they lose to Minnesota. But there's no more room for error. The Warriors are 69-9, and they have to win their final 4 games of the season to break the record, go 73-9. They have 2 games to play against San Antonio, and they have 2 games to play against Memphis. Now, the games against Memphis, people think the Warriors will probably win those games. They're heavy favorites. The one that they play at Memphis ends up being very close. But these 2 games against the Spurs, obviously, are going to be a much bigger challenge. So they beat the Spurs at home to improve to 70-9. And then they win at Memphis, a game they won actually just by 1 point, to go to 71-9. And now they are in a back-to-back. So the night after they play in Memphis, they have to play in San Antonio for a chance to tie the record at 72-9. Okay. The one time the Warriors had played in San Antonio earlier in the season, they lost. They lost 87-79. The Warriors, the 2016 greatest offense ever, maybe Warriors, were held to 79 points by the Spurs, which was by far their lowest scoring total of the season. A couple also important things to note here is that this was an incredibly good Spurs team. That this team was supposed to be the main challenge for the championship to the Warriors. The Spurs go 67-15. This team is really good.
Yeah.
The Spurs, an interesting thing, I said the Warriors had just blown a chance at having a perfect season at home. The Spurs are 39-0 at home on the season. So to now get redemption and to tie 72 wins, the Warriors have to stop the Spurs from being the first team to ever go undefeated at home for an entire
That is epic. That is epic.
Even more interesting, and the Spurs are 2 games away from doing it. They're 39-0. The Spurs have also, going back to the previous season, won 48 straight games at home. This is where the story starts to get really interesting. They're on a 48-game home win streak, which is the second longest home winning streak of all time, only to be beat by the Warriors' home winning streak that ended the week before. So a couple of things here. The Warriors now, they're trying to win their 72nd game. They are on the second game of a road back-to-back. They are trying to defend their all-time record for the longest home winning streak, and they are trying to stop a 67-win Spurs team from completing a perfect season at home for the Spurs, which is already a lot of subplots. I told you there are so many subplots heading into this game. That's not even the final subplot. The final subplot to this game is that the Warriors entering this game in San Antonio have lost 33 straight road games to the Spurs.
Wow.
Yes.
Something had to give.
33 straight road games to the San Antonio Spurs. They had not beaten the Spurs in San Antonio since 1997. This is 2016.
Oh my God.
Now, this streak, again, everything's a streak with me. This is the second longest streak all time of one team just beating another team over and over and over again at home. Actually, the Lakers won 43 straight home games against the Kings from between 1975 and 1992, which is absolutely ridiculous. And I'm happy Brevin is not here to hear that. But this is so again, this is the Warriors have lost 33 straight at San Antonio, the second longest streak ever, while trying to go for their 72nd win, while trying to defend their streak of home winning games, while trying to stop the Spurs from going undefeated at home. And they're tired because they just played a 1-point game against the Grizzlies yesterday. And they're trying to get their 72nd win of the season. In the first quarter, and as you guys will remember, the Spurs that year were an absolutely incredible defensive team. Best defensive team in the league. I just absolutely incredible. I mean, Kawhi Leonard, a big part of that. But just their whole team is just based on defense. And in the first quarter, obviously, and earlier in the season, the Warriors scored just 79 points the last time they went into San Antonio. So in the first quarter, the Warriors score 14 points.
That's insane.
Yeah. They pulled the Steph, Clay, Draymond, Harrison Barnes and Andrew Bogut. That's the rest of the starting five, but they still have, all the guys, Iguodala, Livingston, Maurice Spates, who was one of my fan favorites on that team.
Mo Spates, man.
They get held to 14 points at the end of the first quarter, and by halftime, the game is a tie, 35-35. So this is going to be a real low-scoring, grinded-out game. The Warriors going up against this intense Spurs defense, they're going to be absolutely exhausted. In the third quarter, they start to, if you remember almost anything about that season, despite the fact that they won 73 games and they ended up losing in the NBA Finals, you'll remember that.
Don't remind me.
You'll remember that the Warriors were famous for their third quarters. This was a team that they were down at halftime by double digits so many times. And in their third quarters, they would every single time go on these crazy runs. They would erase 10, 15, 20-point deficits in the third quarter alone. I don't have the number on me, but over that quarter, just the third quarter, the Warriors were outscoring their opponents by more than 5 points a game, I believe, just in the third quarter alone. And so the third quarter comes. Steph Curry hits a couple quick threes early in the quarter to get the run going. Clay hits a two. Andrew Bogut hits a shot off an offensive rebound. Andrew Bogut scores again. They go on a run where they score on 5 straight possessions, and they take a lead. But the Spurs being the Spurs, they shut it down, and the Warriors actually get droughted a little bit for the rest of the quarter. And it's still a 62-61 game after 3 quarters. And it's all going to come down to this final quarter for the Warriors to tie history, to, break all the Spurs streaks and to, get the bad juju away of, it's been 19 years since the Warriors have won a game, in San Antonio. Some of the younger guys on that team, on that Warriors team, would have barely been born at this time. You look at a guy like Ian Clark, who is coming off the bench for this team. Ian Clark, born in 91, so actually he would have been a little bit older. But again, kids that were just babies the last time that the Warriors had won a game in San Antonio. And with everything on the line, the Warriors come through in the fourth quarter with a big 30-point quarter. Again, they had scored just 35 points in the whole first half, but a big 30-point quarter to give them a 92-86 victory. This is a game where everyone on the Warriors struggled pretty much exclusively except for Steph Curry. Just 11 points for Draymond Green, 9 points for Harrison Barnes, the second leading scorer on the team, Klay Thompson, with just 14 points. So not even a great night for him. Steph Curry, in one of these most important games of his career, at least for the regular season, goes for 37 points against the Spurs, accounting for almost half of the Warriors' entire point total. He goes 13 of 22 from the field, hits 4 threes, makes all his free throws, and a big 37 from Steph Curry leads the Warriors to their 72nd win to tie the all-time record from the Chicago Bulls. And then if we remember, I think it was 3 days later, actually, the Warriors break the record with a blowout home victory against the Memphis Grizzlies, where Steph Curry drops 46 points, and that game is over by halftime. It is happening the same time that Kobe Bryant is playing his final game and dropping 60 points, which is crazy that we had these 2 historic moments happening at the exact same time. And it really felt like the Warriors, to get over all their demons of having, a lack of success against the Spurs, historically losing their game in San Antonio earlier in the season, and to get to that 73-9 record, their last major hurdle was to go into San Antonio and win. And it was not easy at all, but they were able to pull it out like the historic team that they were and like you would expect them to, which I think was even part of what made it so surprising when they did end up losing in the NBA Finals, because this was a team that, they had 69-9 record, 4 games left. They needed to win all of them. They needed to beat the Spurs twice, who are going to be the 2 seed in the West. And they had that big clutch performance to get themselves to 72 and eventually 73 wins. And just with all of the, again, like I said, all of these crazy subplots that are going on behind the scenes, for them to be able to put it all together for one last, big victory in an important game, I think says a lot about how crazy that team was and how good that Spurs team was.
Both of those teams were immaculate at the time. And it's amazing when you think about how great that Spurs team was and how they also had a very comparable record to what the Warriors had when it came to playing at home at a time when the Warriors had put together a team without Kevin Durant that was considered the best offensive team that had ever existed in the league's history. They were averaging 114 points per game that entire regular season, and were shooting over 40% as a team from 3-point range. Yes, it's ridiculous. And they set so many records. They set the records for the most home wins in a season, the most road wins in a season, the most wins in general, obviously, with the 73. They were the best team when it came to the starting records and the fewest number of losses since the 80 Celtics with Larry Bird, for crying out loud. Everything about them was compared to that 95-96 Chicago Bulls team that Jordan was on. They go 72-10. They win the championship. And even though the Warriors lost this year to Cleveland in 7 games, they still had more wins in the regular season and the postseason, with 88 total wins in the year, than even that Bulls team had. They beat them by 1 game. The Bulls, even though they won the championship, they had 87 wins. This Warriors team had 88, but they still wound up losing the championship. Regardless, one of the greatest seasons that has, I personally argue, the greatest season in NBA history for any team, and just incredible considering the fact that the Spurs were right with them the entire time. And any other year, the Spurs would have been, again, one of the most historically impressive teams in this same season too.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the crazy things about this is that, we could have had potentially another, Spurs Heat series if the Warriors weren't around and the Warriors did get that 1 seed. But if you want to talk about how this season ends for the Spurs, this Spurs team, again, the 2 seed in the Western Conference, and everyone is so excited for this potential series between the Warriors and the Spurs in the conference finals. And they get not in the conference finals, I believe, but they do get a series against the Spurs. I think it was the second round the following year, which is the famous Zaza Pachulia, game where he takes out Kawhi and then the Warriors end up sweeping. But the Spurs are the 2 seed there, and everyone wants them to play the 1 seed Warriors. But in the second round of the playoffs, the Spurs run into who else but the Oklahoma City Thunder, who take them out in a 6-game series, 4-2. And then the year after, or the series after, of course, the Thunder have that 3-1 lead over the Warriors, and they end up losing that series, which sparks Kevin Durant going to the Warriors, which some people say breaks the NBA. But again, even to get to that series against the Warriors, the Thunder had to beat that incredible Spurs team. So they definitely earned their spot in that series. So just, incredible to see how that happened. And now that I'm looking at it, the Zaza Pachulia series that I mentioned, that was the Western Conference Finals. So they do get that Western Conference Finals matchup just a year later. But incredible to see how the Thunder were even in that year, even able to get past the Spurs was incredible. And then the fact that they almost got past the Warriors also.
Yeah, that was crazy. I remember that season just like yesterday, actually. I remember the Celtics loss and then the Spurs game and everything. And I actually remember, I think it was at some point earlier in the year, they were playing the Thunder and it was a Saturday night game. And it was in Oklahoma City. And I believe that was when Steph Curry hit that ridiculous 3-pointer at the end to win it. And Mike Breen was like, bang, bang, bang. And it was just so insane. And
unbelievable.
We knew that was like on the path to getting to 72. So yeah, it feels I'm happy that you did that story, because it feels like yesterday that happened. But I also forgot a little bit about it until you just brought it up.
Yeah. Again, there's so many crazy stories from that season. Again, with that, I mean, that's one of the most famous shots in NBA history, just the overtime one in OKC. And the fact that OKC then went up 3-1, and we have the famous Clay Game 6. And just the 2016 season and the playoffs that came after it were just so incredible. There's so many stories there.
And don't forget, too, at the same time when the Warriors, literally the exact same day they set the record for 73 wins, was Kobe Bryant's last game. That was the last game that he played with the Lakers, and he had 50 points. Yeah. So, I mean, there's nothing that season will be one of the greatest in NBA history forever.
Absolutely. One of the greatest seasons in a story. And again, like this, I think a lot of people remember because it was on that Kobe night and also them breaking the record, the 73rd win. But I think that 72nd win, actually, even if people remember a little bit of the context of that game and the fact that it was against the Spurs, just the fact that there were so many kind of other things going around same game, I think makes it a really crazy story. And like I said, so many great stories from that 2016 season. But there you go. There is my slept on Spurs story after you guys have both of your slept on.
Well done, man.
Stories.
Great topics today. My goodness.
A fun day with you guys doing our special Spurs Week edition, getting to talk about DeJuan Blair, getting to talk about the Grizzlies winning their first ever playoff series as an 8 seed, and then about the Warriors, their final last hurdle on the road to 73 wins. Maybe we'll have another themed episode in the future at some point. But for now, again, a great episode, and thanks to both of you guys for joining me today on the Slept On Sports podcast. Remember, everybody, if you have enjoyed listening to the podcast, make sure to give it a rating and a review. And subscribe to the podcast. Follow us on Twitter at slept_on_sports. And we will have more episodes coming for you. Hopefully every Monday now is going to be our new schedule. It's the schedule we started with, and I think we're back on it. So more episodes coming in the future. Thanks once again to Mike and Brandon, and thanks to everyone out there listening. And we will see you real soon. See you guys.
Thanks.